Spiritually, one of the ways my parents formed me was their consistent refusal to get cable. I mean, seriously, we had 3 channels the whole time I was growing up. If it sounds like I'm complaining, I am. But you try to make it through a whole summer where there's blocks of the day with nothing on except soap operas and local news. It was torture. I say it was spiritually formative because with only 3 channels, you develop a lot of patience. Not a lot of joy, but a lot of patience. So I grow up and go off to college and come home for a visit, and guess what my parents have done? They've got cable. Hundreds of channels. Apparently, without me around, having only 3 channels got a little boring. Spiritually, one big issue we have is how often we seem to get stuck at a certain point in our maturity, and we just don't get past that. Like we don't keep growing. This is sometimes called the holiness gap. And basically it's this, that there's a huge number of Christians in the world, and we don't want to seem judgmental, but it seems kind of apparent that there's a huge number of Christians in the world and fewer actual disciples of Jesus in the world, right? There are more people, it's safe to say, who believe than who follow. And we've talked in this series already about the tension within ourselves, about how we all, of course, want to be saved, but there are times where we're not quite sure we want to sign up for holiness. As we go through this study together, what I hope for you is that it sparks in you a desire to recognize and pursue the holy, to not settle for the ordinary when the extraordinary is possible. And I wonder if one reason many of us get stuck spiritually is because we think God's only broadcasting on like 3 channels. Right? We often treat spiritual formation like it's a one-size-fits-all thing. What are the 3 channels God uses? Well, there's the church, the Bible, and prayer. And if those aren't working for you, try them again, right? It seems to me that that discounts God's creativity. Now, I should say, before I get in trouble, I love those 3. I love the church, I love the Bible, and I love prayer. I dare say those are all essential for our spiritual maturing. But think of how wildly creative God is and how much He desires a relationship with us. Doesn't it make sense, more sense, to imagine that He's broadcasting on hundreds of channels? The truth is that God communicates in many ways. The holy is all around us. We just need to tune in, so to speak, to find the channels that clearly speak to us. Or imagine if you went to a doctor and no matter what was wrong with you, no matter what symptoms you have, the doctor just kept prescribing the same exact medicine over and over again. Well, similarly, maybe you've talked with somebody about feeling distant from God or feeling in a rut or in a lull spiritually, and that person looked at you and said, well, you know, you just need some quiet time. You just need a quiet time with you and God. Now, if you're wired a certain way and in the right season of life that allows time for quiet, that's really good advice. But what if you're not? What if you're the person whose brain shuts off if you sit still? What if you're in a season of life where there just isn't a lot of quiet around your home? Can we instead imagine God growing us in all sorts of ways because He made us each unique and His love and creativity knows no bounds? In other words, can we imagine God having more than one prescription and more than 3 channels? In John chapter 11, Jesus' friend Lazarus dies, and He goes there to raise him from the dead. But before that, He greets Lazarus' 2 sisters, Martha and Mary. And earlier today, I was at a funeral. And grief, death is the hardest thing we encounter. Grief hits us so hard, but it hits us all in a different way. There are moments and people who want answers and moments and people who just want to be held. And anyway, we know a little bit about Martha and Mary. And what we know is that though they're sisters, they're very different people. Martha is more organized and task-oriented, and Mary is more relaxed and free-spirited. Okay, keep that in mind. Jesus comes to Lazarus' tomb, and He greets them one-on-one, and He loves them both, of course, but you'll see that He greets them very differently. John chapter 11. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet Him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into this world." Then, verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Now, did you see it? Jesus knows that Martha is more of a thinker. She's got questions, so he engages her theologically. And he knows that Mary is more of a feeler, so he meets her emotion with emotion of his own. He knows them well and loves them as they need to be loved. He loves them, he meets them where they are and loves them uniquely. One in more of a heady way and one in more of an emotional way, one with answers and one with tears. Jesus really is a great physician, and he knows just what we need. We can trust him to grow us, to meet us where we are, and to grow us all, but to grow us uniquely, one by one. Maybe you've never found a habit that clicked for you spiritually. Or maybe you have, and it's worked for years, but now it feels too mechanical, too familiar. You're in a rut. Perhaps it's time to seek out a new prescription, to surf around and find a new channel. Years ago, Gary Thomas wrote this book, Sacred Pathways. And what he suggests is that just like there are personality types and love languages, there are also different spiritual temperaments, meaning that we're all wired to connect with God, but we're wired to connect with God in different ways. It's not one size fits all, this project of spiritual formation. So some channels or paths will work more naturally for you than they do for me, and some more naturally for me than they do for you. And so to grow spiritually, we need to seek out the right path, right? The right prescription or the right channel. So Gary suggests that there are 9 of these holy paths. And in your group, you're going to have a chance to take an assessment and see which of these will be the most natural way for you to connect with God and to keep growing spiritually. Or perhaps you've taken it in advance of watching this video. Well, after a brief overview of these 9, you'll have a chance to discuss and dive deeper as a group and see how each of you connects with God best. And my hunch is you're going to be surprised at the variety of responses from one person to another in your group, which just gets at, again, the many ways that God is creative and the many ways that God communicates with us. Real quickly, what are these paths toward holiness? Well, first, there are those who connect with God through nature. They connect with God best when they're surrounded by all that he has created. If that's you, you're a naturalist. And if you want to grow spiritually, you better make sure that you get out of the office regularly. Second, there are those who connect with God through the 5 senses. You connect with God best through art or music or when you're in a space that's really beautiful and awe-inspiring. If that's you, you're what he calls a sensate. And you better make sure that you make time to drink in beauty if you want to grow spiritually. Third, there are those who connect with God through ritual. You connect with God best through habits and sacraments and familiar symbols and forms of prayer. And if that's you, he calls you a traditionalist. And if you want to grow spiritually, you better make sure that you have a set habit, a set practice, personal practice of prayer, worship, or devotion. Fourth, there are those who connect to God best through solitude and simplicity. You connect by being alone. You don't have any need for noisy music or organized liturgy. You just need a little bit of silence. If that's you, you're an ascetic. And you better make sure that you have some margin in your life. That's going to be really important for you to grow spiritually. Plenty of time to spend alone with God. Fifth, there are those who connect to God through changing the world, right? You connect best with God when you're fighting for what you believe in. If that's you, you're an activist. And you better make sure that you're actively volunteering, actively advocating, actively evangelizing if you want to grow spiritually. Sixth, there are those who connect to God by loving others. You connect with God best when you're meeting someone else's needs and providing tangible acts of care. If that's you, you're a caregiver, and you better make sure that you make time for others in your regular life if you want to keep growing spiritually. Seventh, there are those who connect to God through joy. You connect with God best when there's passion or something to celebrate. If that's you, you're an enthusiast. And you better make sure that you're engaged in worship or counting your blessings or some other form of celebration if you want to keep growing. Eighth, there are those who connect to God through relationship. You connect with God best when you imagine His love or when you feel His love or express your own adoration to God. If that's you, you're contemplative. And you better make sure that you take time to practice the presence of God to keep growing spiritually. And finally, there are those who connect to God through your mind. You connect with God best by thinking and learning and understanding. If that's you, then you're an intellectual. And you better make sure that you make time to read, listen, and keep studying if you want to keep growing. Okay, that's a lot to take in, and likely you've already forgotten some of those. But you've got materials on hand to figure out more and go deeper and discuss. But what this gets at is that just as each of us is made and loved by God uniquely, we also grow in holiness uniquely. I hope that discovering your own holy path encourages you to take a next step toward God. And Mom, if you're watching, I hope you're enjoying all those channels.